My name is Dr. Vance Ginn. I'm the director of our Center for Economic Prosperity and the senior economist at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Thank you all for being here. We're hoping to have a great discussion with a wonderful panel on TRS, the Teacher Retirement System of Texas. And hopefully have a good discussion about what needs to be done and the things that are maybe causing some issues along the way. Maybe look at some solutions and things of that nature. Whenever you think about pensions, we're really talking about retirement. And we're talking about what are those retirement benefits going to be? How can we make sure that they are secure for teachers across this great state? How can we make sure that taxpayers are also secure, that they're not paying too much in taxes over time? So there's a lot of factors to look at. In your chair, you should find two one-pagers that we put out recently between the Reason Foundation and the Texas Public Policy Foundation. One is just important pension terms and definitions. It's also on our website at texaspolicy.com, where we have a paper that looks at the TRS pension overview. It just looks mainly at the issues, not any solutions at this time. Let's just really talk about the details of what is going on with the teacher retirement system. And there's another one on another one-pager, Teacher Retirement System of Texas, why 80% funded is not enough. Just something for you to look at and think about. I don't know if y'all know, but this interim in between the last session, there's been a lot of talk about school finance. Have anybody heard about school finance? We've heard about that a lot so far here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation's policy orientation. It's just a small deal, right? And there's a lot of talk about property tax relief. I'll moderate a panel on that later this afternoon. But then there's also a lot of talk about how do we spend those dollars and spend them the most wisely where more money is going into the classroom. There's also a lot of talk about teacher pay and where quality teachers should be paid more. Well, whenever you pay teachers more, that also influences how much money they will receive in pensions in their retirement system later on. So all of this kind of goes together. I think whenever you think about what's happening with school finance, I think we would be remiss if we didn't talk about what's happening with pensions and the teacher retirement system overall. I mean, when these teachers go in to teach, we want quality teachers to be there, want them to be paid well, and also to have a good retirement to live on. You know, many teachers don't pay into the Social Security system. So there is that area where you have a pension, a retirement system that's providing them some form of retirement later on. And so it's something to really think about as we go through our conversation today and look at the details, look at what solutions are out there, and I'm looking forward to a great discussion. So let me go ahead and introduce each one of the panelists. So first, we have Stephen Gassenberger. Stephen is a policy analyst with the Reasons Foundation's Pension Integrity Project. Prior to joining Reason, worked as a consumer advocacy manager for Xerox Corporation, specializing in financial consumer regulation and compliance. He also worked as a senior associate for Stateside Associates, where he developed state-level management strategies for a variety of policy areas. He graduated from the University of New Orleans with a Bachelor's of Arts in International Relations and receives a Master of Arts in Public Policies from Tel Aviv University. Please give him a round of applause. Next to Stephen is Monty Exter. Monty is a lobbyist for the Association of Texas Professional Educators. His primary focus is covering school finance legislation, issues affecting the teacher retirement system of Texas, and federal matters related to Social Security. He previously worked for the Texas Legislature as an aide to State Representative Mike Villarreal. He has an undergraduate degree from the University of Texas and a law degree from Baylor University. Please give him a round of applause. And last but certainly not least is Mr. Josh McGee. He is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and chairman of the Texas Pension Review Board. He's an economist whose work focuses on evidence-based policy and public finance. He's a leading retirement policy expert and has written extensively about the retirement plan design, benefit security, and sustainability. He has provided expert testimony and technical assistance in more than 50 jurisdictions across the country. You've been busy. Traveling around a lot, huh? And routinely provides state and local governments with retirement policy advice. Please give him a round of applause. So I'm looking forward to just having a good conversation here. what I'd like to first start off with is just opening remarks. So if you would, maybe give a good 4, 5, 6 minutes, just opening remarks about TRS and kind of lead our way in through the rest of the discussion. Stephen?
Sure. Is this on? Yes. Okay. So just to kick off the conversation, I want to talk about how we see TRS in general, just to set the bar. Over the holidays, I had some friends visit me in Houston, where my wife and I currently reside. And every time somebody visits me in Houston, I bring them to the Johnson Space Center. It's awesome, highly recommended. Outside the front of the Johnson Space Center is the shuttle. That shuttle is a great way to look at pensions. It is a vehicle. It looks like all the other planes. It's very unimportant. It's not conspicuous at all. But once you walk into it, it's a spaceship. It's got millions of buttons and switches and dials and knobs and everything that you can think of that this spaceship can do, you can do it. Pensions are a lot like the shuttle. It's a vehicle to bring you to retirement. And in that show, actuaries, board members, anyone who has a stake in the pension program can twist a knob, push a button, flip a switch. Expectations, assumptions can go up, they can go down. Payments can go up, they can go down. COLAs can go up, they can go down. You can do whatever you want with it. DC, DB, doesn't matter. They're all vehicles. So when we're having this conversation and we get into the weeds and we start talking about billions and billions and we start talking about millions of teachers, we want to keep in mind that this is just a vehicle. This is just a mechanism, okay? We can push a button and make it do whatever we want. So when we have these conversations, we want to make sure we have everything on the table, all options are explored, and we're not coming into the conversation thinking we can't do this because of some ideological reason. We're trying to get to a secure retirement for our teachers, and we can do that by examining all the buttons, all the switches, and all the knobs. And just like the shuttle, you can do it in a way that can take you to the stars. But just like the shuttle, you can flip the wrong switch, you can turn the wrong dial, and it ends in disaster. So let's keep that in mind as we have this very thoughtful, very important conversation with our teachers today.
Thank you, Stephen. That's a good way to open it up. Monty?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really glad that we're actually having this conversation today. First of all, there has been a lot of focus on school finance coming into this session. It's also going to be a very important session for pensions, TRS in particular. I hope everyone in the room is aware that TRS has made some changes over the interim in changing some of the buttons that have been talked about, changing some of their assumption rates in order to make sure that the system stays sound and is really on track to actually get to the moon for the folks on board. Then we need to make a little bit of a difference in some of those other levers that we can adjust because of the fact that TRS has adjusted their lever. I think it's really important to note that TRS is a little bit different than a lot of the other major pension funds that you'll see out there, particularly municipal funds or funds that are less controlled at the state level. You've really only got, you may have millions of buttons, but they're all attached to one of 3 different functions. You're either adjusting your contributions, you're adjusting your assumed investment performance, or you are adjusting the benefits that you're paying out. Your contributions and your investments have got to equal what your benefits are, or you're going to run out of money at some point in time. Most pensions out there have an ability to really impact all 3 of those levers. It's important to note that TRS as an agency only has the ability to impact the investments lever, and that's kind of rare. They don't set their contribution rate, and they don't set the benefit rate. In both instances, that is a function that the legislature has taken. And so we are really looking towards this next legislative session to make sure that we get those other 2 levers aligned to work with the new trajectory that the investments have been set at. which we personally feel like is actually a much better trajectory. There was a lot of consternation over the fact that the assumed rate of return was coming down. But the truth of the matter is that having an assumed rate of return that is higher than what is reasonable is not a good way to run a fund. At the same time, you can't lower the rate of return or the assumed rate of return and then not do anything with the contributions rate. That is not a good way to run the fund either. So now that the TRS has done their part, it's time for the legislature to step in and do theirs.
Thank you, Monty. Josh?
I don't know if I'm going to be able to continue this space shuttle analogy. It's a high bar to keep going here. So just a quick review of the facts. So the teacher retirement system, my wife is a school teacher, participates in the teacher retirement system, so full disclosure. So I have a vested interest in making sure this thing works. Teacher retirement system was overfunded as recently as 2001. Now it's just 77% funded, so there's been a pretty steep decline in the funded ratio. That's about average for plans in the United States. We've seen a decline of funded ratios kind of across the board. Now, the title of this session has the word crisis in it. I actually kind of reject that title. We're not in crisis right now. However, the reason we're talking about this is to avoid reaching a crisis. Crisis situations are bad for everybody. Solutions are hard to develop in crisis situations. And there you're talking about how to distribute large amounts of pain. And we want to avoid getting to that point. We're seeing some, I can do it, flashing buttons on the dashboard of our shuttle that we need to make some corrective action, or we could end up with some pretty dire consequences. I would argue we're already seeing some of those consequences. So if you look at the size of TRS's pension debt, the unfunded liability is just debt that is owed to teachers through the retirement system. That's all it is. The size of that is about 2.5 times the size of Texas's general operating debt, and is about the same size as all other debt the state of Texas, its agencies, its universities have, which is around $53 billion. The TRS pension debt is 46, so they're of the same scale. So it's big. It's big relative to Texas's budget. It's big relative to the resources that Texas allocates towards public education. It's just a big deal. And the state's actuarially determined contribution, the employer contribution, has grown by more than 70% since 2009. So we're seeing pretty steep increases in the required contributions here. That's faster than the budget of the state of Texas has grown, which is about 10% over that same time period. So what that means, whenever you see a budget line item that's growing faster than the budget, there's going to be some crowd out of other stuff. Now, pensions, teachers' pensions are viewed kind of within the realm of public education. So a lot of the time when we talk about pensions, it's not a separate conversation from school finance, it's the same conversation. And it gets wrapped together. And teachers tend to, in Texas and other states, lose out the most whenever contributions to pension systems have to increase because of underfunding. They feel this through flat salaries. They feel this through reduced benefits, no COLAs. They feel this through job conditions. They feel it through fewer teachers being hired. They feel it through buildings that are not kept up as well as they should be, classroom supplies. All of these are affected by increased pension debt payments. Pension debt payments are going to pay down accrued benefits accrued in the past, not new benefits for new teachers, but we're paying down debt because the state of Texas and its employers didn't pay enough in the past. Now, the 8% discount rate is a big part of that. So there have been some remediation steps taken. I agree with Monty completely that it's time for the state of Texas to adopt a real funding plan for TRS, or we're going to continue to see increasing pension debt and the need to increase payments and continued crowd out of education spending. It's just going to make it hard to do much of anything else. If you look at teacher salaries, if you look at COLAs, some of those consequences that I've talked about are playing out in Texas. Teacher salaries across the state have been flat or increasing slightly. You look at COLAs, a lot of teachers have not received, retirees have not received a COLA in many years. That erodes their purchasing power over time. That's a big deal. If you don't, these teachers are going to be retired for 20 or 30 years. And if you don't receive a COLA over that period, you're going to quickly lose half to 2/3 of your purchasing power over that time period. So we need to take action because teachers are losing out. due to rising cost. It's also affecting the state budget and district budgets. So we talked about funding. We need action on funding. We need a plan to pay down the pension debt as quickly as possible. We need better funding policies going forward that take us off a fixed rate plan and move towards actuarial funding. And that may take some shared sacrifice. However, our benefit right now for teachers is already pretty skinny. So I think there are reasonable steps that can be taken by employers, so school districts and the state, to adopt a better funding plan, put more money into the plan. I think we need to take a look at those investments, though, too. If I look at the investment policies of TRS, it's a very good system. They've got great experts. However, they've shifted pretty heavily into illiquid, hard-to-value assets. So they've shifted very heavily into alternatives, into private equity, into real estate. Now, there are reasonable things that you can say for reasons that you should do that. You're diversifying, you're trying to make sure that you can deliver on the assumed rate of return. However, there are big questions for me about whether a public entity that has a call on taxpayer dollars that teachers are depending on should be investing in that way, should be increasing their risk level in opaque investments that it's hard to understand. What's more, fees have increased pretty substantially. So investment fees for TRS, if I'm looking at this right, is around 84 basis points. So almost a percentage point on assets if you include the admin costs as well. That's pretty high. That's high for any retirement system. It's high for certainly a retirement system of TRS's size. Even when you compare to private sector plans, that's high. That's a lot of investment fees. And the reason is because of these kind of difficult to manage, opaque investments that the plan has shifted into. They have hired lots of staff to do that. They have an office in London to make sure that they can manage those investments. So it's an increase in the effort on the investment side that may not be good policy, and I think we should take a really hard look at that. So we need to look at investment policies too. So funding, investments. I think that we're in Texas. Part of the conversation is always going to be about alternative plans for new employees. I think we need to have a structured, evidence-based discussion about that. I think there are reasons to believe that the final average salary model may not be the best for the next generation of teachers. It's not very flexible to changing economic and demographic conditions. And we could talk about how to provide investment and longevity protection, so annuities and pooled investments, maybe with some guarantee going forward through a plan that's simpler and easier to manage, that is more flexible to changing careers. But I think that conversation, we need to take the ideology out of it, and we need to have an evidence-based discussion.
I think that's great. And thank you each for your opening remarks. So just kind of hit some of the highlights that I went through, because I went through a lot of great information there. So we're looking at is that they lowered the teacher retirement system, lowered the assumed rate of return, which is the rate of return that they're assuming over a period of time, right? From 8%, which it was before, down to 7.25%, right? And that raised the unfunded liabilities from about $35 billion to about $47 billion, correct? And when you look at the actual rate of return over the last decade, the average annual return has been closer to about 6%. I think it's like 5.8%, 5.8.
5.8.
If you use something closer to 6% assumed rate of return, the unfunded liabilities would be closer to about $85 billion. And so I think that was something that we were looking at whenever we titled it. You're right, we're not currently in a crisis, but we don't want our teachers and our system to be in a crisis moving forward. So what are some of the things that have gotten us to this point? We're going to talk about some of the solutions and things of that nature, but what's gotten us into this situation that we're in today, from y'all's perspectives?
Well, I think, one thing that I do want to address right before we directly address that question is the snapshot nature of looking at particular slices of time when you're looking at what the actual rate of return has been. You can pick up or drop off a couple of years, and that number varies wildly in terms of impact on fund, because it only takes a couple of percentage points to vary wildly when you're talking about this field. So if you look at a 20-year, it's way above that. If you only look at an 8-year, it actually goes up substantially because of the way that TRS's smoothing works. So I think that you have to be really careful whenever you're looking at those particular slices of time because it's really easy to choose a slice of time that favors your argument, whatever that argument is. You know, I could go back and say, well, over the course of the entirety of TRS, they have more than hit their 8% mark, and so they should have stayed at 8%. But I don't think that's realistic going forward. At the same time, I'm not sure that picking up two major, fiscal crises is really particularly good analysis looking forward either. One of the most frustrating things I think that their actuary has said in the past is that looking at past funding is a zero prediction of future. Looking at your past rate of return predicts your future rate of return almost not at all. And so I just want to make sure that we really think about that as we're going forward as well.
So on that point, I tend to agree that arguing about the discount rate is unhelpful. Nobody up here has a crystal ball that will tell them what the go-forward rate of return is. If we did, we wouldn't be up here. We'd be investing. We might be investing for TRS. And we're not. We're up here pontificating on what they should do. I can tell you, though, the higher the discount rate, the lower the funding end of the plan, and the less secure the benefits are. And so regardless of what you think future returns are going to be, the higher that rate of return is set, the less money that will be going into the plan on an annual basis, and that means the less secure the benefits are. So lowering the rate of return assumption takes risk off the table because it means higher contributions into the plan. That's a good thing. And we could argue to death about the discount rate. I mean, my big thing on the discount rate is, okay, you got the rate of return over the last 30 years, so why the $46 billion in underfunding? Yeah. Where'd that come from if you hit all of your assumptions? That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And part of it is timing. Part of it is, so your returns this year are gonna matter a whole lot more than your returns 30 years ago because the plan's bigger. Yeah. But we can take that off the table and really anchor it in how secure do we want the benefits to be? How much funding risk are we willing to take? How much funding risk are teachers willing to take? We talk about contribution certainty. One way to get contribution certainty is to lower the discount rate. If you lower the discount rate, you are putting more money into the plan, and you are at less risk of having to increase your contributions in the future because you didn't put enough in the past.
Hey, Josh, what's the contribution rates, just so the audience will know, for the employer or the state and the teacher?
So right now, I believe the employee contribution rate is 7.7. The employer contribution rate is a little over 7 right now. And
Yeah, I think it's 7.7.
Well, it's the state is 6.8, sort of, and districts are 1.5, sort of. Again, because of the way that actually works out. So districts actually pick up part of the state, and part of the 1.5 doesn't actually get paid at all because it only applies to districts that don't pay into Social Security.
Right.
now, if you
Which
look
is
at
which is a number of them, though, right? That don't pay
It's
in?
only a small number of districts, but one of them is AISD, so it ends up
Okay.
being a number of teachers.
Okay, that's what it was. All right.
If you look at those contribution rates, so the teachers always pay for their own benefit. Their contribution goes for their own benefit. It doesn't fund the benefits of anybody else. They can always withdraw their contributions plus interest out. The state and employers are contributing another 3.14% towards the benefits of teachers. All in, the cost of benefits for teachers going forward is a little over 10% of pay annually. The rest of that contribution from the state, more than half of it, around 60% of it, is going to debt, is going to pay down debt. So a huge part of the employer contribution is going to pay down debt. They're actually paying very little towards the benefits of teachers. Teachers are paying the bulk of their benefits costs at current discount rates.
Yeah. Stephen?
I'll make a quick point about looking back to predict the future. In 2000, TRS, the investment breakdown in TRS was mostly equities, bonds. Currently, right now, we're 50% in high risk investments. So the portfolio is different. I mean, you don't drive a car looking in the rearview mirror. You look through the front windshield. It's not the same. It's not the same beast as it was just 20 years ago. So I would hesitate to push back on adjusting our future predictions or assumptions because of the comfort that the data over the history of TRS has given us. So I'll just make that point.
Are there some other things that you've looked at within your research on why we're at where we're at today, with having $46 billion in unfunded liabilities?
Oh, it's missed investment assumptions and the debt on that. I mean, that's all. That's the vast majority of it. Yeah. So in the last, I'm just looking at some numbers here. In the last 10 years, what I would consider to be a market upswing, right? We have hit a 5.8 return on investment. So, in the last since 2008, you would think that TRS would be gaining ground, but in fact, it has exponentially been losing ground. I mean, a mountain has been created out of TRS. A mountain of debt has been created, and the trajectory is just skyrocketing.
But I also know that, Monty, you've talked about the contribution rate, though, as being a contributing factor. But, and so I want to maybe explain some of that.
Right. So, and in fact, that's a great lead off to where I was going to go. I think that,
We've had
where
some
you
good
can
discussions on Twitter. You
right.
should follow them on Twitter as well.
And this is actually even beyond what we've talked about on Twitter.
Yeah.
I think that one of the things that you can look at going again back to the early 2000s is there was a point in time when TRS was overfunded, and the legislature's response to that was to drop the contribution rate down to the constitutional minimum and then leave it there for way too long. So while investments certainly have driven part of this story, contributions have also driven a large part of this story, in that the legislature really was fairly malfeasant in what they did with the contribution rates. When you're looking at sort of the health of a pension, there's sort of two different slopes I feel like you have to look at. You have to look at what the overall liabilities are, and then you also have to look at the size of the fund and how it's generating an amount of money to be able to meet those particular liabilities. And the issue is the gaps, right? So right now we have a gap, and the gap isn't, I would say, again, in crisis mode. I agree with, Josh there. But the larger the gap you get, in either instance, you sort of start to do some exponentialing, I guess, not a word, but we'll make it a word today, in that if one of your lines starts to move, then it can quickly get out of control. And so...
Kind of compounding.
That's right. And so leaving that contribution rate where it was for way too long really allowed that gap to get away from us a little bit. And it's not at the point where it's, something that we have to, really be in crisis mode over or can't fix, but we are at a point where we really need to do something about it. And we did start to do a little something. The legislature did a little something about it back in 2014, 13, 14, in that range. But again, that was on an 8% assumption return. And it was about the most, I hate to use this word because it brings so much context in. It was about the most conservative thing in not the political sense, but I think in every other definition of that word, that they could have done to basically just get it to where it would pull back in line on all of the old assumptions. And so now that we've changed some of those assumptions, we have to come back. And I would really argue that, we should really think about doing more than the absolute minimum to get it back in line, because the longer you leave that gap in place, the more you're just dumping money into the gap over time. Yeah. The faster you can get up over that gap, you're actually doing much better job of spending money wisely for the state, even if you spend a little more up front.
Yeah, and some of the things they made those changes, the legislature brought the funded ratio above 80%, and now maybe it's down to 76, let's say. Is that really important? You can build on what they were saying too, Josh, but is the 80% really important? Like, where should we be on the funded ratio?
We're coming out of a decade bull market, so we should be overfunded at this point.
Overfunded, grossly overfunded.
And we are not. I mean, the target should be 100%. Yeah. We want benefits to be fully funded as they are earned. Yeah. We don't want future taxpayers to be on the hook for service that was rendered by today's teachers. We don't expect future taxpayers to pay the salaries of current teachers. We don't expect future taxpayers to pay for anything that we enjoy today unless they're getting some benefit from it, except for retirement. And we push a lot of cost off onto future taxpayers through that. So the target should be 100%. We're in real danger right now. We've gone through a 10-year bull market. Everybody kind of has seen what's happened with the markets over the last couple of months here. At some point, there's going to be another recession, and we have made no recovery in TRS. Zero. In fact, we've lost ground over a 10-year bull market. Let that sink in. If you look back, you talked about dual financial dips. We made very little recovery between 2001 and 2008. The problem is this doing the bare minimum doesn't work. Continuing to nibble around the edges and do kind of the least you can do, where if you squint, maybe you could bring it back in line within maybe 30 years or so at some pretty aggressive assumptions. That doesn't work. We've lost ground over the last 20 years doing exactly that. And while the legislature does bear some blame here, I think the plan, TRS, its board of trustees, also bears a significant share of blame. They kept the investment rate of return at 8% in the face of declining funded status, in the face of returns that were below that. And they very aggressively advocated for keeping it there. Anytime anybody would raise it, they would aggressively challenge you on that. Now they've lowered it, that's exactly the right thing to do. TRS just put out a benefit plan study. One of the things that is disconcerting to me, I think the study that TRS put out this year is much better than what they've done in the past. But every time a pension plan puts out this study, they tend to pat themselves on the back. The entire study is justification for exactly what they're doing right now. They write the study and say, exactly what we're doing is the best way to do it. And I think we've got to have a real discussion around what does it take to actually fix the system. I think it's going to take more contributions, and I think this bare minimum recommendation that we're seeing from TRS this time around is not enough. And so we need to go beyond that to really fix it. I think part of the TRS's calculus is a political calculation. How much money do we think the legislature is actually going to allocate here? I think that's not their responsibility. The TRS board, in some ways, by calculating the politics of that, are subjugating their fiduciary responsibility to political concerns, which are not their responsibility. Their responsibility is to make sure the fund is healthy and in good fiscal shape to deliver benefits, and they should say what it's going to take to actually fund that system.
Yeah. Go ahead. Just a little context around the assumed rate of return. When you ask market watchers, JP Morgan, BlackRock, and all these guys, 8% return, they assumed, they gave it a 25% chance of hitting 8% return. When TRS lowered it to 2.75, you would think that they
7.25?
7.25, sorry.
Whoa, that's really low.
you would think that'd be a 50-50, but they still give it 33% chance. I mean, the 50-50 doesn't come in until you get into the fives and 5 3/4. I mean, you brought up conservatism. I'm going to bring it up in its theoretical context. You would think Texas would be conservative in their approach to fiscal, they'd be fiscally prudent, their investments. Currently, right now, the state of California, just going back to the speaker's speech this morning, the state of California is vastly more conservative than Texas.
What?
They assume 5.8 return on investment. So let that sink in.
Interesting. I don't know. Hopefully, y'all aren't glazing over too much. I love this discussion. I'm geeking out right now about this discussion about numbers as an economist and everything. And so,
sorry for the numbers.
Yeah, it's fun. And so, let's turn over to maybe some of the solutions and potential solutions, and maybe some areas where we disagree. I always like those things. I taught at Sam Houston State University for a couple of years before I started at the foundation. And in higher ed, they have this opportunity to either go into TRS, where after 5 years you're fully vested, or you can get into the optional retirement program, ORP, where you're fully vested after just 2 years, and then you can take that along to wherever you want to go, which is more of a defined contribution sort of route than the overall sort of defined benefit plans like we have today. And I just wonder could that be a path forward for maybe new hires to get into a defined contribution sort of plan to where maybe they have a choice? Or do teachers not really want that? I mean, what might some teachers want some differences and make sure that we don't have this crisis that maybe we're not in now but won't happen in the future, allow for some changes like that to keep us from getting to a crisis?
Well, the second half of your question is easy to answer. No, they don't. Teachers have been very, very clear about what they want, and they don't always necessarily look at it from a number sense. I'm perfectly happy to be upfront about that. They're human beings, and they look at things from a level of what they are familiar with and comfortable with. But they have a fairly good sense about how their retirement system works, and they absolutely want a defined benefit system. Now to get into the second part, or first part, I guess, of your question, about whether or not it's a better idea, it really depends on what you're asking, what you're looking for as to whether or not it's a better idea. If what you're looking for is retirement security, then it's going to cost more in the long run to get a same level of retirement security out of a system that looks more like a defined contribution, more like a 401k system. You just have to put more money in to ensure that you're going to get the same benefit out.
Especially if you want predictability.
That's right. For predictability of benefit, it costs you more.
Yeah.
Now, if your goal is to simply reduce the liability on the state, and it's not to create retirement security for retirees, then sure, not guaranteeing a benefit is a great way to reduce liability on the state. It's also a great way to have hundreds of thousands of teachers not be retired in a secure fashion.
Yeah.
So I have a different perspective on this. I think that a lot of the rhetoric around different plan design is wrapped up in ideology. It costs more camp is driven by folks who work for pension plans and pension plans. It's really easy to devise cost equivalent plans of any plan design, whether you're talking about a final average salary plan, a cash balance defined benefit plan, a defined contribution plan. It's really easy to design cost equivalent plans that provide both investment and longevity protection. Yes, you can have a range of protections in any of those plan designs, but it's just simply not a true statement that one costs more than the other. The real conversation we need to have is, are we helping all teachers reach retirement security? I think the answer to that is, our current DB is pretty skinny. And so a lot of people, if you look at the teaching workforce, about 40% of teachers will leave teaching in Texas before they reach 20 years of service. And a lot of those teachers aren't saving enough. They're not leaving with enough to really put them on a secure savings path. So they're going to have to make up for that in their next job. So that's a lot of teachers. That's a lot of people who teach, who render service in our classrooms in Texas. If we care about retirement security, we've got to care about them. I think we need to have a real conversation about how we help them reach retirement security. I think we've also got to talk about the full career people. If I look at full career people, teachers in Texas that have retired, I don't think the benefit is overly generous. I think that that's just rhetoric. In fact, I think it's losing value over time, and that's really problematic. What's more, a lot of our teachers don't participate in Social Security. Social Security, for all its flaws, and I know people probably have strongly held beliefs in this room about Social Security, for all its flaws, it's a completely portable defined benefit system that you can take anywhere in the U.S. you want to go, to any sector. You earn that defined benefit plan. Our teachers don't get that. And while there may have to be some changes to Social Security, it's not going away. It's not going to literally fail. You may push out the retirement age a little bit. This coming from a finance guy. You push out the retirement age a little bit and you fix that system. Now, there's going to be lots of rhetoric around it, but our teachers don't get that protection. That's a big detriment to our teachers. That 40% that leave before 20 years of service don't have that, and they're retirement insecure, and that's a problem. So I think we need to have that conversation. We need to have a conversation around how much longevity, so what kind of annuities do we want to provide? Do we want more flexibility around retirement age than we have right now? How much investment protection do we want to provide? Do we want some risk sharing between the government and employees so that you have more cost certainty so that you don't run into these funding problems? Those are the conversations we need to have. I could very quickly design you a DC system that meets all our objectives. I could also design you a defined benefit system, whether it's cash balance or final average salary, that meets most of our objectives. I would argue that it's harder to meet all of your objectives under a final average salary DB system than a lot of others, and we're seeing some of that play out. I don't think we should throw out DB systems, but I think that we should talk about our objectives and try to modernize our system going forward for new workers,
Nice.
while making good on our deal with current employees and retirees.
Yeah, I think that's important. Stephen, do you have anything to add there, or what have you also seen across the nation, maybe some other changes that have been made?
Well, first, I want to piggyback off of Josh's
go for it.
point and spotlight our data when we looked at the annual reports of TRS says that 40% of teachers leave TRS within 5 years. 5 years. 18% make it to full retirement benefit. 18%. So if TRS is selling, a product, they're only selling it to 18%. It's a product that only 18% of people want at the end of the day. So there is a vast majority of the teaching population here in Texas is not being served by the products that are being offered. So that's something that we should spotlight. In other states, we've been approached by unions in Arizona and Michigan, and they've seen the writing on the wall. They've seen that the cost of the plans are skyrocketing. It's beginning to crowd out a lot of the other priorities of those states, and they've approached us. Cost sharing was a proposal that they brought to the table. The public safety in Arizona brought to the table, and in that same vein, they were their weight on the boards also changed to reflect the risk that those plans were taking on, and those public safety officers were taking on. So I mean, it really is. I hesitate to pull out my list of naughty and nice states and all the things that each one of them did, because Texas is Texas. It's so big, it's so unique that it has to come from Texas, whatever the solutions are. But there are some common threads. The assumptions that we make need to be more conservative. There's no doubt about it. We're in a different financial market today than we were 20 years ago, and Texas, of all states, needs to reflect that.
Yeah,
for example.
Yeah, I mean, one thing about it is the way to improve education. There's a lot of talk about doing that right now, but I mean, the research is pretty clear that the teacher in the classroom has the best direct connection with the amount of education that's going to happen, right, with that particular student. So we need the best teachers in these classrooms, and making sure that they have a good benefit that's secure over time as well. And so we hear a lot of this talk about school finance and what's going on with property tax reform and how that money should be delivered. What do you all see what might happen in Texas this year with school finance reform that could touch the benefit system and help it to be more secure for teachers? Anything?
That's an amorphous question. So...
Or maybe what would you like to see? It would maybe be a better way.
That is a whole different answer.
Okay,
let me go with the first one there.
Okay,
so
all right.
I think one of the things that got brought up in the last round that we talked about a little bit, that the school finance reform can impact to some extent, is teacher turnover. So we talked about the fact it is not a function of the pension system that we have a huge teacher turnover problem within the first 5 years. Pensions undoubtedly are a reason to stay in a profession, right? The way that we have designed the current pension system. But that particular reason, I don't know, is particularly strong within the first 5 years of teaching, and that's where we lose a lot of folks. Reworking the finance system will help us to pull one of the two levers that really influences that, which is teacher salary. Teacher salary certainly has a large impact primarily on who's going into the system to start with, more than who stays in the system. Most folks are leaving the system within the first 5 years because they get there and they figure out how hard it is. Teaching is not an easy profession. It's very challenging, particularly with the student populations that we have. and particularly with the amount of resources that teachers are given in the classroom in order to utilize. But making some changes there and keeping folks in the profession longer certainly has an impact on this conversation. One other point that I did want to touch on, since we were talking about looking at some other states, Texas was mentioned to be unique. Texas is unique amongst other states in a really particular way that's not great when it comes to the pension plan on the contribution side, since we've also talked about how much we're paying into contributions. Texas is dead last in the amount that it pays into contributions. Not only are we dead last, but among other states that by and large don't pay into Social Security, we are less than half of the contribution rate of the next lowest state, and we are less than 2/3 of the contribution, away from 2/3 of the median. So yes, contributions into pensions are very expensive,
With a
but
statutory cap.
with a statutory cap. Not that we're anywhere near the statutory cap. We're not. We could not actually get up sort of into the higher averages because of our statutory cap, but we can get much closer to where we need to be without having to actually reach without having to bust the cap.
With
let me
the
put it that way.
new assumed rate of return, I would put money on the table to say that the actuaries will bump up. If we ask the actuaries, what will it take to get us out of this hole? We'll be well over that 10% cap real fast.
Absolutely, and I will say right now, like I am not up here to defend only asking for the bare minimum. I mean, I personally would like to see us incrementally over the next 4 to 5 biennia over the next 10 years or so, get our way all the way up to the cap, both on the employer side and the employee side. Again, I'm not here my primary goal, and this is what our members have told us in the association, is neither to maximize benefits for retirees, nor to be overly concerned with the cost of the state. We don't want to break the state's budget because obviously that's not feasible. At the same time, we don't want to completely leave retirees out in the cold on their benefits, but it's to have a healthy fund. And so going basically to the cap, both employee and employer.
See, Josh is ready.
I'm ready. I was just going to join the call. I would love to see a 10-year plan for actually paying down the unfunded liability over time with conservative assumptions and a solid funding policy. Even if that's not fully achievable, I would like to see the plan, and actually my organization, the PRB, push that a little bit to say, here's what it would really take to get there if we want to be aggressive in making sure that benefits are secure, so that we put a stake in the ground on that. So we anchor that conversation in not just kind of, and to be fair, TRS has taken some pretty substantial steps, especially with the discount rate change. I think the contribution recommendation is low. I think it's going to take more money. I think that it's not like out of this world more money. And so I think putting a stake in the ground on what it's really going to take, what a 10-year plan would look like, it's going to look a lot more achievable than I think people expect, and will help us move in that direction. So I want to see that. On public finance, on school finance, this should absolutely be part of that conversation. These should not be separate conversations. And I echo also what Monty was saying. For teachers that don't participate in Social Security, the TRS benefit is low. It's below average across the states. It's low. So is pay. Pay is below the median for the United States. So both on pay and benefits, Texas is below the median. Pay is the biggest single factor that will affect recruitment and retention. You can talk about everything else. Pay is what's going to affect it. Job conditions. Those two things are huge. People want to know that they have a good retirement plan. Entering teachers have very little knowledge about the retirement plan, though. If you ask them what kind of retirement plan are you in, they couldn't come up with the terms. If you supplied the terms for them, they couldn't pick the right one. It would be, you would see kind of a third if you gave them 3 choices. That's not a big factor, but they do have a sense that their retirement plan is good and will protect them. And that's important to them. And we need to deliver on that. Pay is more important, and that needs to be fixed. But to get there on pay, we have to fix the retirement system.
Yeah, it all goes together, right? Monty, on the pay part, so we've been in favor at the foundation increasing teacher pay, and in particular
Excellent.
Excellent.
Okay.
And for quality teachers to be paid more. We want quality teachers to be in the classroom. And as an economist,
well, you don't have to be an economist, but a quality workforce is important, right? For a well-educated workforce is important for our economy to sustain the Texas model of strength that we've had over a long period of time.
Here's my quotable. If the quality in my sector's workforce isn't good, the
Yeah.
quality in no sector's workforce will be good in this
That's
state.
good. No, that's right. Yeah, you're right. I wonder, though, I think where maybe some of the disagreement, I don't know if it's just debate, discussion, is on how do you measure the quality? Like, how do we determine how much teachers should get paid more, right? Because some will say, well, we can't just teach to a test. I agree. What other metrics can we use? What a teacher, do they want across the board sort of pay increases? Or how can we determine who are the quality teachers?
Right. So there's a couple questions in there. So let me put out our base statement first, right? This is what we've always asked for. Folks think that all we will ever want are across-the-board pay raises. That is not correct. ATPE, and let me just make this statement for all of the teacher groups, because I am one of 4 statewide. None of us are opposed to differentiated pay plans, differentiated compensation. We are all various degrees of opposed to straight-up merit pay, particularly as that merit pay is based on STAR testing. STAR is a snapshot. It has limited utility in determining the performance of a student, and the psychometricians that develop tests will tell you it has almost no utility because it wasn't designed to do this, to determine the quality of the education the student is receiving, or at least the quality of the educator. That said, when you're doing evaluations, certainly some of the evaluation is going to be based on student performance, and that's different than just saying STAR testing, right? Although in some folks' minds, 181 of them, it isn't always different, but it clearly is. And that's also not new though, right? Like our system has actually incorporated student performance and teacher evaluation for a very long time. It's only when you start talking about how much student performance and how are we going to measure that student performance that you start to have some chafing occur. So really what we want is an adequate base. We are not at an adequate base at this point in time. We would like to see some unflattening, right, of salaries over the course of a career, because right now, salaries are low from start to beginning if you live in rural Texas, and if you live in urban Texas, starting salaries are actually pretty darn good for first-time job just out of college. But then when you've worked for 10 years and you look at the person who starts day 1 and you're on day 10, if trends hold, they're going to be making the same thing they're making on day 1 that you're then making on year 10, because starting salaries have risen at the same rate that raises have. I'm not saying if that's good or bad, but I'm saying it's irksome to people. And it's also not how any other field works. Now, when it comes to evaluating folks, right, somehow this is not an issue in any other profession, but it is in ours. In no other profession do we have this great consternation over allowing folks to determine whether or not their workforce is doing a good job, but somehow it is a big consternation within education.
Any other, before we get to Q&A, because I'm sure there's a lot of questions, so y'all get ready. We're going to have some mics coming around. Do y'all have any just kind of closing remarks as we get ready for Q&A? Stephen?
Sure. I mean,
A minute or two.
yeah, if we want to give the legislature some to-do items, first item, plan design. Look at the plan design and design a plan. Cap TRS today. Whoever's in it, you owe those teachers, right? Those are contracts that have been signed, and by both the state and teachers. You owe those teachers the benefits that you promised them. So that ship has sailed. Cap that and look at how to design a plan that addresses the teacher population in Texas that the data says is there. 18% of people, like I said, make it to full retirement. There's a huge population of teachers out there that TRS is not serving. because they don't have options. So I would recommend the legislature to offer teacher options. That would be my takeaway.
All right. Monty?
So what I would love to see them do as far as putting a plan in place, and it's kind of a 10-year plan, like Josh was saying, I would love for them towards the end of this biennium to begin by bumping the state contribution up to its next full percent. So from 6.8 up to 8, or up to 7, and bump teachers from 7.7 up to 8. And then beginning in the next biennium, I would like for every year until we get to 10% to bump up an extra quarter each successive year until we get there. In addition to that, and you can't really look to future legislatures and binding them, although, right, future legislatures are mostly the same as this legislature. At least for this session, I would also like them to, since everyone's talking about spending out of the rainy day fund, particularly in the Senate, crazy bizarro world, that is a great one-time expenditure, right? Money we put in today is worth way more than money we put in later when you're talking about a pension system. And so I think that whether you are talking about just funding the rate that TRS says they want to get to over time, or the rate that I would like to get to over time, somewhere between 1.5 and a little over $3 billion this biennium, but not out of the actual GR budget, out of the rainy day fund. We will still have billions more dollars out of the rainy day fund that they could spend before we even get down to the 7.5 that they're going to want to keep in order to make highway transfers.
All right, thank you. And Josh?
I'm not going to be anywhere as specific as Monty just was. I think that, coming away from this, any pension conversation, it's easy to get kind of gloomy. Actually, Texas is not in terrible shape. This is fixable with reasonable changes. I think we need to take action now, or it gets more painful. And so we need to have a conversation about what contributions really need to look like. We need to tie the state's contribution to the state and employer's contribution to what's actually needed to fund the plan instead of having a fixed rate. I would love to have a kind of a broader conversation getting to this 10-year plan so that we can, instead of being very focused on budgetary requirements right now, we can have a broader conversation and actually create a plan to get to a good place over time. I think that while we can't bind future legislatures, the legislature can say what the expectation is and force future legislatures to say notwithstanding. And so I think putting into place strong funding policy for state pensions, putting in place some guidelines around investments, a little more kind of oversight and scrutiny around investments. I don't think that the state should be heavy-handed there, but I think there needs to be a little more oversight given the call on taxpayer dollars should be put in place. And then I think we need a plan design discussion that takes some of the ideology out and recognize that we've got to make good on our promises today, and that we may want to consider simplifying and modernizing the system going forward.
Great. You have one last thing?
Yeah,
All right, go.
one last tiny thing. I do also think that the state should adopt the PRB's recommendation that all major pension plans should have a structural COLA that is not above inflation.
And is funded.
And is
And
funded.
is funded.
That's right. And is
All right.
funded.
Thank y'all so much. Let's get over to the Q&A from the audience.
Hi, my name's Terry Leo, and I just retired December 31st.
Congratulations.
So thank you. I have a couple questions. I know the Lieutenant Governor has mentioned, yesterday that he would like to see a $12,000 pay increase for teachers. How can that be sustainable? How does that affect TRS funding? Also, there's been a lot of talk about merit pay, and I kind of asked that question yesterday. I worked with special needs students, so which is always hard to come by teachers for that area because they are the most difficult learners who will have failed like STAR tests since 3rd grade. So, you take a student with a low IQ or, whatever the issues are, that's always going to be difficult to determine that based on a test, and basically that's what the talk is of using that. But, and two, if we go to merit pay, again, that's more money. How is merit pay and salary increase going to affect my TRS?
Thank you, and thank you for your service as a teacher. Anyone like to answer?
I can hit that real quick.
Okay.
When you retire, you get, on average, just generally, super generally, 80% of your pay back. That's the calculation. So You raise the pay, you raise that percentage in the background. So just right off the bat, there's a correlation there.
Now, TRS makes assumptions about pay increases already, and that's kind of built into their calculations. If the pay increases exceed those pay increases, it kind of hits two ways. It increases the benefit. It also increases the contributions going in. Unless you kind of have off the charts increases especially for people who are close to retirement, I think that pay increases are going to be relatively negligible. So they should be relatively small, especially of the magnitude that we're talking.
Okay.
Yeah, one of the cost drivers, I guess, in some of the pay increases where TRS comes into play is more on districts than it is on TRS because everything is based on statewide payroll or district-wide payroll. So obviously when pay increases, the contributions increase. The state, and this is why I was saying it was sort of a quasi-soft number before, right? The state pays in 6.8%, but only of the amount of the minimum salary schedule. So as pay goes way above the minimum salary schedule, the district is actually paying the contribution, both their 6.8% and the 1.5% they're already tasked with on dollars above that. So anytime the legislature is going to have a large pay increase, they need to consider that cost as part of the cost of that pay increase when they're going to give districts money to afford it.
All right, thank you. Bill?
Yeah, if you assume that the rainy day fund, which is probably a pretty good idea, but let's say the legislature decides that's not an okay use of that money. Would you tell me how many dollars are being spent by the state for TRS during the current biennium, and how many of each of you would have the state put into TRS in the coming biennium? Not percentages, but actual dollar numbers.
You're going to make us deal with dollars, huh? So I'm much more comfortable talking about percentages, and I actually don't have the dollars in front of me. I'm trying to buy some time for Stephen to look up the actual dollar figures here. I think we're talking around
I want to see some tap dancing.
We're talking around $2 billion extra across the biennium here. Is that accurate, Stephen?
Well, I can do the extra in dollars. If you talk about the TRS's ask, so to get to exactly where they were before the assumed rate change, they need $1.6 billion. If you want to get down to 30 years
in additional funds.
Yes, sir. If you want to get down to a 30-year rate, you need $1.76 billion. As far as what the current percentages, non-additional funds, right, what the formulas are already drawing, I don't have those off the top of my head.
Around a 2 percentage point increase on payroll.
And Governor Patrick has spoken about the use of rainy day to buy down debt. I mean, is there much support in your all's view to take some of that rainy day fund and buy down what is a debt of the state?
From my perspective, we've seen states, New Jersey being chief among them, act as if they don't actually have to pay their pensions, as if it's not an actual obligation of the state. But as in New Jersey, I don't see any either political will or will of the courts to reduce actual liabilities. So that would mean actually reducing the accrued benefits of teachers. I think this is a pretty solid debt of the state that needs to be paid, and I think it should be treated as an accrued debt of the state and should be paid off as such. So I'll answer that part of it, and you can talk about the rainy day fund.
I think that there has been some discussion of it too, thanks in large part to the comptroller, because over the last couple of months, the comptroller has done a really good job of making sure that the legislature is aware that one of the chief things that rating agencies look at, because we really want to protect our state's credit rating, is pension liability. And so using one-time funds to sort of shore us up in a little bit better spot as we are getting into our plan to address pension liability overall is something that is both wise and that they have begun to think about.
And I would just add a little bit there and say, one-time money is good on paper and in front of the camera, but you still are swimming in risk in TRS. So you're going to be in the same place later on down the line if you don't change a myriad of other things too.
Right. Specifically, you got to fix the funding policy so that it actually matches planned costs, so that you don't end up putting money in and ending up in the same situation in 10 years.
Right.
If you just put one-time money in, that's an Illinois solution.
Yeah, the one-time money is certainly not a solution. It's just to make sure that you don't lose ground while you're building into your solution, because getting to where you should be in 10 years today is ridiculously expensive.
And if you look at the Texas pension reform generally, so Houston had one-time infusion of cash, but that was combined with comprehensive reform measures that put a cap on city contributions. If you are going to do one-time money, it needs to be combined with substantial changes to funding investment policy to make sure that you never end up in this situation again, because you don't want to do one-time money and not actually fix any problems.
Yeah, because I mean, there is like you said, the comptroller has this legacy fund idea to basically invest part of the rainy day fund money, which is supposed to be about $12.5 billion at the end of the current biennium and up to $15.4 billion by the end of the upcoming biennium, is to take a share of the rainy day fund and invest it into higher returns, riskier assets really, and then use the returns in order to pay down some of the pensions. And so I think that could be an option, but one thing I think you also want to pair that with is reform, because that could just be kicking the can down the road if you don't have some of these other changes that's been discussed.
And I'll say the legacy fund idea is certainly has merit and is worth looking at, but it's a very long-term solution, right, to become a funding stream. While I think that they maybe should go ahead and look at doing that, I don't think that replaces the value of just a straight-up one-time infusion now to pay down some of our liability while TRS itself is building towards its 10-year plan.
And just if I was in the legislature today, I would also, and I'm sure the controller his controller is thinking about this as well. If you're either way, if you do one-time money to TRS combined with reform, or you do the legacy fund, we're talking about investing that money, and so timing is going to be important. Even though we've seen some upheaval in the markets, equities are still pretty expensive, and we may be heading into tumultuous. You can't just dump the money in and get the returns next year. There's going to have to be a period over which you put the money in. So that's a little bit of a complicating factor to that timing is important, that it's not just you flip the switch and all of a sudden you're getting the return.
Yeah, and one other thing that's kind of been brought up about the legacy fund idea is it does disconnect the amount of spending from the state from the taxpayer paying taxes. So one part of sound taxation is you want government spending to be felt by the burden of the people who are paying taxes. And if you have rates of return, that return paying for something, you're disconnecting the taxes from the amount of expenditures. Just something out there.
And we're going way down this rabbit hole.
I know.
But this is a lot of fun. So if this was a real solution, then we should just take out debt and put it into a legacy fund and invest that. And nobody would think that is a good solution. It's not a lot. We've got money sitting around and we want it to be active, but taking money out of the economy has its cost too. Sure. And so we just have to be careful around this logic, because it falls apart pretty quickly.
I do think it's important to remember that in this instance, right, we're not talking about sales taxes, we're not talking about property taxes. We are only talking specifically about a fund that is 100% funded with severance taxes. The most volatile of our tax streams that hits only a very small number of taxpayers.
True.
Who are either raking it in or not at the time when that particular tax is coming in. And so really, many states have done this because it is somewhat irresponsible to simply collect all those taxes and then do nothing with them.
And severance tax are those that are collected by oil and gas production, just to make that clear. All right. You've got the last question. We got about 5 minutes.
Yeah. Justin Miller with the Texas Observer. I wanted to switch to the investment policy side and ask about what you guys think about the role of public pensions kind of ramping up their investments in alternative investments, in private equity and hedge funds. As you mentioned, they're laden with high fees and a lot of overhead on the staff investment side. And what role that over the last 10 years in really reallocating the investment portfolios has played in kind of creating this current state of fiscal state of the public pensions, not only TRS but ERS and some of the other big ones as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. This is a trend across the country. I think TRS has ramped up their alternative investment and moving that in-house a little more than average, but this is a pretty significant trend across the country moving into alternatives. Part of what's caused this is in a declining interest rate environment, delivering on the investment rate return is hard. And so you have to diversify into other assets. One of the ways that you can try to get higher return, higher risk premium is locking up that money for longer. So investing in illiquid investments. And so that's what some pension plans have done. I think we need to have a very open dialogue, public conversation around whether that's appropriate for a public entity and how much risk we're willing to take there. These are very opaque investments. In fact, often, even under freedom of information requests, we can't get the terms of these investment deals because it's proprietary. From my perspective, personally, I don't think that a public entity necessarily should be investing heavily in that way. We need to have more transparency around how we're investing. It's unclear what the value is. If you go back in time, these asset classes did deliver higher returns. However, those fields are getting very crowded. Private equity has a lot of new entrants. It's very crowded. Hedge fund industry is very crowded. When a field gets very crowded, it's harder to find that little extra edge. And we're seeing that play out in returns of those asset classes. In pension plans and university endowments, it's just harder for them to make the outsized returns than it used to be because those fields are crowded. There's going to be convergence across the returns of publicly traded equities versus privately traded equities versus private equity itself versus real estate. I mean, economics 101 is that there's not going to be any one investment that is going to be outsized because there should be some level of convergence there. So I think we need to have an open conversation about that. And personally, my view is that we should probably dial back investments in these opaque, hard to value, illiquid investments and err more on the side of transparency.
All right. Any other comments? Well, thank you all so much for this discussion today. It's going to be a continued one. Hopefully we'll see some real reforms this session for the security of teachers and for taxpayers alike. Please give the panelists a hand.